It's wonderful to be with you. I want to talk about, and I want to pick up on some of Joe's ideas and talk to you about project implementation. Because it's so bright in here, I'm not going to use my slides. You can take a look at them perhaps online after, but I want to just talk you through some of the ideas of project implementation. We talk a lot about project planning in this region. If you think about the election campaign that was just fought, you probably know very clearly where the Premier, Ms. Wynne, stands on her transit plan for the region. You probably know where Tim Hudak stood on his plan for the region, subway, subway, subway. You know where Rob Ford stands on his plan for transit development. You know where John Tory stands. You'll hear where Olivia Chow stands. We talk a lot about lines on a map and delivering infrastructure and what should be built. We tend to talk a lot less about how to build it and how to ensure that once we make the choices, the projects that we build actually get done well, get done efficiently, and get done in a way that's cost effective and don't have large cost escalations. So it's interesting having this conversation on St. Clair, a region where there's been a lot of debate about both what got built, but also how the project got done. And I thought Joe gave a spirited discourse on how that project experienced its escalation from its initial cost estimates through to the scope changes up to where it ended. And also how the delays that took place on that project, what their causes were. And I would let you know, as someone who's studied these projects around the world, that for every project that has experienced a cost overrun, and in the transportation sector, the international experiences, that is 9 out of 10 of them, are experiencing cost overruns, there's always a pattern, there's always an explanation, and there's always these local factors that you can explain why each project experienced this escalation and these delays. And yet when we step back as academics, we tend to start to ask a number of questions about why this continues to happen. Joe, I thought, in his talk was really reflective, and there's a lot of learning that can take place from these experiences, and we can transfer that learning from one project to the next. And so this has been a pattern that's been observed for over 100 years of projects that we decide on building, then not being delivered in the way that we expected and having cost overruns and having delays. You would expect over that period that we would learn something and that we would get better and that projects would have less cost overruns over time as we learned. And yet that hasn't been the pattern. My colleague, Bent Fluberg, who's at Oxford, collected a large sample of projects in the transportation sector, but now in dams, in IT. He's looked at these projects around the world. They span 100 years. And the pattern is the same today as it was 100 years ago. We continue to experience cost overruns and delays on these large projects. Now, why is this relevant? Who should care about this? And I think that the discourse around the St. Clair disaster really explains to you why this is so important, why we should care not just about building the right projects, but also once we decide, then making sure that they get done properly and don't have these large cost overruns. I would like to suggest that there's this idea of the successful failure and the failed success. And we can start to try to think about what that might mean. So the successful failure would be a project where you pick the project, it gets done really efficiently, everyone's happy about the way the project gets delivered, and then once it opens, it kind of disappears from our public imagination. So we do a great job implementing it, the planning is good, everyone's happy, and then it kind of disappears and doesn't really live up to its expectations. All of us in our minds can probably think of projects in Toronto that have gone that way. The Shepherd subway expansion would be one that comes to my mind. By all accounts, that project was delivered relatively efficiently. And yet, in terms of how it's working as an actual transit project and as a community building project, at least to this point, 10 years on, even longer than that now, it hasn't really necessarily lived up to that expectations. Perhaps it was set up to fail, it's built too short, it doesn't connect origins and destinations. There is development that's happening, but it's taken a decade, and that project has been subsidized both in terms of the capital cost, which is recovered none of, but also its operation costs. And some of the figures that I've seen bantied about are about $10 million a year. So if we're 13 years into that project, we're looking at $130 million in subsidies just on the operations. It's a successful failure in many ways. Then you have the failed successes. That's the other side of the coin, and another way of thinking about this. You have projects that maybe experienced cost overruns, maybe experienced very painful and conflictual processes of delivery. And I would put the St. Clair streetcar into that bunch. Projects that had a lot of controversy around them, had escalations in costs for all sorts of reasons, and now are at a stage where they're operational. And once operational, so that's why we're hearing the St. Clair disaster, in large part, when Councillor Ford talks about it, is in large part because of this point about the cost escalation. And now we have a project that's operational, and you have people like Councillor Mihevc who are rightly saying, come and look at St. Clair. This is not a disaster. This has been a real success. And the story in the Toronto Star about safety is another ringing endorsement for why these types of projects as city-building initiatives are really important. But to step back then, I think it really does become relevant for us all to think implementation and quality implementation is important. To make these mistakes of projects going way over budget or escalating in cost opens the door to the critiques of delivering big infrastructure projects and raises questions about whether we as a community and our political leadership and our experts in the organizations that deliver these projects actually have the expertise to deliver them. And so the St. Clair streetcar was always envisioned as the first of many of a rollout of what was at that point called the Transit City Plan, a plan for light rail across the whole region. And you're starting to see the pushback, in large part because of the challenge in delivery and the impact on some of the businesses, but also the issues around traffic. You're starting to see the pushback of that. And I think I would argue that, to some extent, the subway mantra is really a reaction to this the implementation challenges that project faced. Now, we're experiencing implementation challenges today on many of the projects that we're building here in Toronto. So you hear about the Union Station project, you hear about Nathan Phillips Square, you hear about the St. Lawrence redevelopment project, you hear about the Sony Center. And I think for people who read the newspapers or just listen periodically, they start to say, well, can anyone actually deliver a project in this region? The costs are always going to go up. We're looking at a transit plan now. Kathleen Wynne has announced a $29 billion transportation budget. $15 billion of that is supposed to be in the region. Metrolinx has a plan for a $50 billion plan. If you start to add the expected overruns onto that, you get really worried. Is this really possible? And it's not just the cost overruns, but also the delays and the impacts on all of the communities that surround those projects. Communities really start to worry, can we really deliver on those expectations? So I think to focus on implementation becomes really important. And listening to the lessons of people who have gone through it has always been part of the experience. And I would say that also academic work, looking at why these projects fail or why they experience these massive cost overruns, is also important. So that's been some of the work that I've done over the last decade, is looking at the reasons why projects, especially on the cost escalations and the delay side, why this starts to happen. So let me reflect really briefly on some of the international experiences for why both the Canadian but also the broader international patterns for why these projects tend to go over budget. The first basket of explanations is the honest mistake, that the project, we didn't scope it at the beginning very well, we lacked technical expertise, or we lacked data. Data is always really challenging. The world changed in between. We found things when we were underground that we weren't expecting. There are all sorts of arguments about the honest mistake that starts to explain why costs escalate on these projects. And when you listen to each project individually, you can very clearly hear how the honest mistakes happen. The escalation that happened on St. Clair, as Joe talks about scope changes, is not just an honest mistake, but actually might be good city building. That might have actually made a lot of sense to try to once you've started, just like as he said, when you're renovating your house, maybe once you have the wall out, why not put in a new window, or why not try to reconfigure things so that it works better for you in the long run? The question is, over time, if you know that those things are going to happen, because they happened 50 years ago, 25 years ago, they happened on the last project you built, surely at some point there's a learning process that starts to kick in, and we start to learn the lessons from the past experience. And I'm comforted to hear that they are learning lessons on Eglinton, and hopefully we'll apply those to other projects, and yet we're still hearing about cost overruns and large time delays. Keep in mind, the time delays are relevant because of the impact that they have on both the businesses and the communities. It's not just the money. The money is one thing, and the public money that's flying out the door as these projects escalate, but also the impact on the surrounding businesses is really substantial. And for example, on St. Clair, when you had the tracks sitting in large part at Dufferin, sitting on that road as these different issues were taking place, earlier planning, even if that project was going to take the full 5 years, you might have been able to plan it in a different way so that the impact on the surrounding communities would have been less. It's hard to predict in advance that you're going to have a year-long delay because of a legal suit, and those are hard to predict. And yet, the upfront planning of these projects is really key, and everyone being on the same page earlier on. Once we've transitioned from thinking about transportation projects just as a TTC project or a Metrolinx project to a city building project, getting everyone in the room earlier on and trying to come to some consensus about what should be built and trying to think of all of these things before shovels hit the ground is really an important part of the puzzle. And so we know that they've now put a new collaborative working organization back into the city who's supposed to coordinate a lot of the planning. And yet we still hear in instances that organization hasn't captured everything. So it's not clear as an outsider how well that's working in all instances just quite yet. But the other side of this equation is perhaps the more pessimistic view of why these projects go over budget. And Professor Fluberg at Oxford goes down this path perhaps more than most. So I'll throw this out there for us to think about, and perhaps we can discuss it, is really the idea that there might be strategic misrepresentations, or people who have an interest in presenting lower cost estimates at the beginning of a project to get the project started, to get the project approved, and then as the costs start to escalate later on, it's very hard to stop a project. So perhaps if your project has a lower cost estimate, it's more likely to get money from another level of government. A lot of projects are competing for public money. And so if your project looks more attractive, it has a better cost-benefit ratio, perhaps it's more attractive to the federal government or to the province. If it has a shorter timeline to build, it's shovel-ready. So if you can present your project as shovel-ready, maybe it gets the money. We heard a lot about that during the economic crisis. We needed projects that were shovel-ready to create jobs. This wasn't just about infrastructure, it was about jobs. So maybe there was an incentive to make your project look shovel-ready. Now, these types of strategic misrepresentations can be both government, different agencies wanting projects so that they have a pipeline of work that keeps them employed, or it can be private sector firms that put forth lower bids. There's all sorts of, to get the job, and then they can try to ratchet up the cost. You hear that all the time when you go talk to the people in the construction industry. Depending on how the contract is structured, the minute the ink is dried on the contract, then they try to start looking for change orders. They try to look for places where the contract was weak and where costs can start to escalate. So this is clearly a much more pessimistic view of why these cost overruns start to happen and why they've persisted. But for Professor Fluberg, at least, he argues, well, we would have solved this by now if these were just repeated, honest mistakes. Yes, it's complicated, but we probably would have solved it. And the fact that the data shows that 90% of if international projects are going over budget and have continued to go over budget in all sorts of sectors, from water to transportation to dams to IT projects, and both public and private sector. This is not just a public sector problem, but a public and private sector infrastructure projects leads us to believe that there's something else going on here. So the question then is really, what do we do about this? How do we solve this? How do we make it so that the incentives are in place for people to, if they make honest mistakes, to correct them, but to try to minimize that strategic misrepresentation, those interests in promoting projects and lowballing initial bids and initial cost estimates for all sorts of reasons. And there's really a couple of potential options that are out there, which we really should be using all of. So the first is clearly to make sure that we have completed plans before we start. You'd be stunned to learn how many projects commence before there's a finished plan, before there's a finished timeline, and before there's a finished budget. That is an invitation for the cost of those projects to go through the roof for all sorts of honest reasons in many cases. The scope changes, or we realize that we should be doing something else once we're in the ground. The problem is on the time side. The delays and the impacts of those projects on the people as they delay or as the costs escalate are really big. And the cynicism in the community that grows about whether we can actually deliver projects opens the doors to people who probably don't want to build anything. To say, the level of competence isn't there, we're not going to give you the authority to build. We're not going to support it with our tax dollars. We're not going to allow for new taxes or revenue streams and revenue tools. And there's been a lot of talk about that in the transportation field. But how are we going to pay for all this infrastructure? And to some extent, if people are cynical that the projects can't be done on time and on budget, and it's going to have huge impacts while they're being done, then they won't support these types of revenue tools and to pay for these types of infrastructure projects. We can also improve forecasting techniques. There's all sorts of ways to understand if in past experiences costs have escalated, let's try to build that into our future costs. If you look in the past in a project, per square mile is one, or per square kilometer is one cost, then you would expect in the future it's going to cost around that same extent. So you can look to other experiences both internally and externally to try to understand how the ultimate costs of your project are, where they're going to be. Then I would argue there's also an important role for public monitoring, and we don't do this enough. There should be a single website where you can check every project, where once the project is approved, that budget is written down on that website. And as scope changes or cost changes occur, that is tracked very clearly in a very public way that's searchable. That's searchable by agency or department of the city, and is also searchable by firm. That would create a real incentive not to have these massive cost overruns for the people who are involved, because they'd be much more public. There'd be a much easier way to scrutinize these types of projects, and you'd start to see patterns. If one department or one agency was experiencing these overruns more than others, you could look into that. If one firm or one group of firms was experiencing these cost overruns or escalations more than others, you might be able to start questioning why that was taking place. There might be very honest reasons for that. They might have had a tough year or bad weather or whatever the case may be, but at least we'd start to be able to track these patterns, and you could have citizens being engaged in this too. It wouldn't just be experts and journalists who have access to this. Now it would be very searchable. And I think that transparency, shining light on these projects and on the budgets and on the delivery of them, lets more people in. And as more people become involved, at the very least they learn why the cost escalated, and in the more optimistic circumstances, they actually start to track and can observe patterns that are taking place, and we can try to clamp down on these incidences of cost overruns. And the final one, which I know is a lot more contentious, is how you involve the private sector and in what role. And do you involve private capital and private financing up front? There's a lot of controversy. Private financing of projects up front costs a lot of money, but governments in Canada can borrow a lot cheaper than the private sector. But it's also the case that if the private sector has what's called skin in the game, or their own money at stake, they have a much higher incentive to actually deliver the project, and less incentive to walk away or threaten to walk away if things go wrong. So we should consider in what types of projects there might be the use of private capital. I wouldn't argue for private capital over a long period, but perhaps during the construction, and perhaps some money invested up front that's repaid as soon as the project is completed. There might be instances where longer-term private financing makes sense, but for the most part, when we're talking about minimizing cost overruns and delays, we might be able to do this just with sort of bridge financing. So imagine paying your contractor at the end of the job instead of at the beginning, so that that person has an incentive to keep working at your job and not go do 5 other jobs while they're doing yours. And to do yours well, and if you have a dispute, at least you have some leverage to try to resolve that dispute. Right? So these are some of the strategies that are out there. But to come back to where we started, I think it's really important that we conceptualize and think about what is a successful failure and what's a failed success, because infrastructure projects are not just about implementation. They actually live and breathe in our communities for centuries, like the projects we're seeing, and the implementation can color how we view these projects. So it's not just the lines on the map, the picking of projects that's important, but also that period of implementation and getting that right is critical to how we see these projects, in many cases, for decades and centuries to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, and Jay and Joe as well. I think all 3 of those talks were fascinating.